Welcome, dear listeners, to Corpse in the Rosewood Conservatory, a Deadly Miss Marple Case. This cozy mystery, inspired by the timeless tales of Agatha Christie, invites you to the quaint English village of St. Mary Mead in the 1950s. Join the sharp-witted Miss Jane Marple as she unravels a puzzling murder amid blooming roses and village gossip. Settle in with a cup of tea. This audiobook is approximately 90 minutes long, divided into 10 chapters for your enjoyment. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Discovery in the Conservatory. The village of St. Mary Mead, nestled in the rolling green hills of England's countryside, was a place where time seemed to pause, as if reluctant to disturb the gentle rhythm of its days. In the autumn of 1952, the hedgerows glowed with the russet hues of turning leaves, and the church bells rang out their familiar Sunday cadence, a sound as comforting as a warm shawl on a chilly evening. The air carried the faint sweetness of late-blooming roses, mingling with the earthier scent of freshly turned soil from cottage gardens. At the edge of the village stood Rosewood Manor, a Victorian relic of grandeur softened by years of ivy and the tender ministrations of its gardeners. Its crowning jewel was the Rosewood Conservatory, a glass-domed sanctuary where exotic plants thrived under the watchful care of Lady Eleanor Hargrove, the manor's formidable matriarch. The conservatory, with its polished rosewood frames and delicate glass panes, was a marvel to behold. Inside, orchids from distant jungles arched their slender stems toward the sunlight, while roses in every shade, crimson, blush, and ivory, spilled their fragrance into the warm, humid air. A small writing desk, carved from the same rich rosewood, sat in a corner, its surface cluttered with Lady Eleanor's gardening journals, a silver inkstand, and a porcelain teacup painted with forget-me-nots. It was here, in this haven of green and glass, that the village's tranquility was shattered on a crisp October morning. The discovery began with a scream, sharp and piercing, that cut through the manor's "Good God, Eleanor!" he exclaimed, his voice hoarse. He reached for her wrist, then recoiled. She's gone. The gardener, Mr. Wilkins, appeared next, his boots leaving muddy prints on the flagstone floor. His weathered face, usually set in a scowl, softened with shock. "Not possible," he muttered, clutching his cap. "She was pruning them roses just yesterday." Victoria Hargrove, the elegant daughter-in-law, glided in moments later, her silk shawl slipping from her shoulders. Her cool gray eyes flickered over the body, betraying no emotion beyond a slight tightening of her lips. "We must call the doctor," she said, her voice steady, as if arranging a dinner party rather than addressing a corpse. Geoffrey Hargrove, the couple's only son, stumbled in last, his tie askew and his hair uncombed. His boyish charm was marred by a pallor that suggested a late night, perhaps at the card tables, if village gossip was to be believed. "Mother," he whispered, then turned away, covering his mouth. The village doctor, Dr. Haydock, arrived within the hour, his black bag swinging as he navigated the conservatory's narrow paths. He examined Lady Eleanor with practiced efficiency, noting the faint bluish tinge around her lips and the rigidity of her limbs. "Poison," he declared quietly, adjusting his spectacles. "Something fast-acting, likely in her tea. I'll need to send samples to the laboratory, but I suspect a plant-based toxin, perhaps from something grown right here." The word poison hung in the air like a miasma, sending a ripple of unease through the gathered household. Poison was not a word one associated with St. Mary Mead, where disputes were more likely to involve misplaced laundry or a disputed recipe at the Women's Institute. Yet here it was, as undeniable as the body before them. Word of the tragedy spread swiftly, as news does in a village where every curtain twitch is a telegram. By noon, the postmistress, Mrs. Cleary, was whispering to her customers about poor Lady Hargrove, done in by her own tea. At the tea shop, Price Ridley, accustomed to Miss Marple's cryptic remarks, pressed on. "They say the police are coming, Inspector Slack no less. He'll sort it out, though I dare say he'll trample through the manor like a bull in a china shop." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Inspector Slack is thorough, in his way, but thoroughness is not always the same as insight. She returned to her knitting, her mind already turning over the details. A poisoned teacup, a half-written letter, a conservatory filled with plants that could kill as easily as they bloomed. It was, she thought, like that curious case of the vicar's wife and the arsenic tea. The answer, as always, would lie in the small things, the overlooked details that others dismissed as trivial. By afternoon, Rosewood Manor was abuzz with activity. Inspector Slack arrived, his brisk manner cutting through the household's grief like a cold wind. He surveyed the conservatory with a scowl, muttering about village nonsense and gossiping busybodies. But Miss Marple, invited to the manor by her old friend Dolly Bantry, a distant cousin of the Hargroves, slipped into the scene unnoticed. Her gray head bowed as if in mourning, though her eyes missed nothing. The conservatory was a study in contrasts, beauty and death intertwined. The roses, meticulously tended by Lady Eleanor, glowed in the sunlight, their petals soft as velvet. Ferns and orchids spilled over their pots, their leaves brushing against the glass walls. The writing desk, where Lady Eleanor had met her end, was a focal point of quiet chaos. The teacup, now carefully bagged by the police, sat beside the silver teapot, its spout gleaming accusingly. The half-finished letter, scrawled in Lady Eleanor's precise hand, hinted at a revelation. "I know your secret, and I cannot." The rest was lost to a smudge of ink, as if her hand had faltered mid-sentence. Miss Marple lingered near the desk, her gloved fingers brushing the edge of a gardening journal. She noted the faint scent of bitter almonds, not from the roses but from upset someone. Mr. Wilkins, standing awkwardly by the door, twisted his cap in his hands. "I only tended the gardens, ma'am. Never touched her tea." Elsie, hovering near the tea tray, fidgeted with her apron. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the slight bulge in the maid's pocket, something small, perhaps a locket or a vial. Nervous creatures, maids, she thought, recalling a similar case in her youth. But nerves can hide guilt as easily as fear. Inspector Slack, impatient with the family's bickering, announced his intent to question everyone. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he said, his tone implying that village amateurs had no place in his investigation. But Miss Marple, settling into a corner armchair with her knitting, knew that the truth often lay in the quiet corners of village life, where secrets bloomed like roses, and poison could hide in a single cup of tea. Chapter 2. The Gathering of Suspects. The late afternoon sun cast golden slants through the tall windows of Rosewood Manor's drawing room, gilding the heavy brocade curtains and the polished mahogany furniture. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax polish and the faint tang of Sir Reginald's cigar, which he puffed with a vigor that seemed more defiant than grieving. The room, though grand, felt stifling under the weight of suspicion that had settled over the household since Lady Eleanor Hargrove's death in the Rosewood Conservatory that morning. The village of St. Mary Mead, usually a haven of predictable routines, buzzed with whispers of poison and betrayal, and the manor was now the epicenter of that unrest. Miss Jane Marple, invited by her old friend Dolly Bantry, a distant cousin of the Hargroves, sat quietly in a high-backed armchair in the corner, her knitting needles clicking softly, a rhythm as steady as the church clock. Her gray hair was neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, and her blue eyes, sharp as ever despite her years, darted from face to face, noting every gesture, every inflection. To the untrained eye, she was merely a frail spinster, a fixture of village life. But to those who knew her, Miss Marple was a formidable observer of human. He spoke. "This is a travesty," he declared, his voice resonant with years of commanding troops. "Eleanor was the heart of this house. An accident, surely. Some spoiled tea, or perhaps a mistake in her gardening concoctions." Miss Marple's needles paused. She noted the way Sir Reginald's hand trembled as he set down his cigar, a detail that suggested more than grief. Men of his sort, she thought, recalling a retired major from her youth, often hide their fears behind bluster, and fear can mask guilt. Geoffrey Hargrove, the Hargroves' only son, lounged in a wingback chair, his legs crossed carelessly. His boyish charm, which had won him favor at countless village fetes, was marred by bloodshot eyes and a pallor that spoke of late nights and reckless habits. He lit a cigarette, the match flaring briefly in the dim light. "Mother was always poking into my business," he said, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "Debts, you know, always harping on about them. But poison? That's absurd. She was too stubborn to let anyone get the better of her." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Geoffrey's nonchalance was practiced, but the way his fingers fumbled with the cigarette case betrayed a deeper agitation. "Young men like him," she mused, "often think charm can cover their tracks. But tracks, once made, are hard to erase." Victoria Hargrove, Geoffrey's wife, sat on a velvet settee, her posture as composed as a portrait. Her auburn hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and her gray silk dress shimmered faintly in the sunlight. She sipped a glass of sherry, her movements deliberate, almost theatrical. "Eleanor was rewriting her will," she said, her voice smooth as the sherry itself. "She told me so last week. Perhaps someone didn't like what she planned to change." Her eyes flicked toward Geoffrey, a glance so fleeting it might have gone unnoticed, but not by Miss Marple. Interesting, Miss Marple thought, her needles resuming their rhythm. A woman like Victoria doesn't speak carelessly. That glance was a dart, aimed to wound. She recalled a similar tray, her apron starched, but her hands trembling. She was a slight girl, barely 20, with mousy hair and eyes that darted like a frightened doe's. "I only brought the tea, sir," she said to Inspector Slack, her voice quavering. "I didn't touch it, I swear. Lady Hargrove was kind to me, mostly. She wouldn't have enemies, would she?" Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Elsie's apron, where a small bulge suggested something hidden. A locket, perhaps, or a vial. Servants know more than they say, she thought, remembering a parlor maid from years ago whose nervous habits had betrayed a theft. But is it fear or guilt that makes her tremble? Inspector Slack began his questioning with Sir Reginald, who recounted his morning with military precision. "I was in the library reading the Times," he said. "Eleanor always took her tea alone in the conservatory. I heard nothing until Elsie screamed." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. The library was just down the hall from the conservatory, close enough to hear a raised voice, or to slip unnoticed into the glass-domed room. She made a mental note to check the library later, for a misplaced book or a smudged glass might tell a different story. Geoffrey's account was vaguer. "I was out late last night. Cards at the club in Much Benham," he said, shrugging. "Slept in. Didn't come down until after the commotion. Mother was already gone." His voice cracked on the last word, but Miss Marple wondered if it was grief or a well-timed performance. Victoria's story was crisp, almost rehearsed. "I was in my room, writing letters," she said. "I heard Elsie scream and came at once. I didn't see Eleanor this morning. She was always up early, tending her plants." Mr. Wilkins claimed he'd been in the garden shed sharpening tools, far from the conservatory. "Don't drink tea myself," he muttered. "Never touched the stuff." Elsie's statement was a tearful jumble. "I made the tea like always, sir, and took it to her at 8 sharp. On her roses and orchids. A faint smudge of soil marked one corner, as if someone had handled it with dirty hands. Miss Marple bent closer, her eyes catching a glint beneath a fern. A small glass vial, empty but for a faint residue, lay half hidden among the pots. She didn't touch it, knowing the police would need to examine it, but she noted its size, small enough to fit in an apron pocket. "Curious," she murmured. "Very curious indeed." Returning to the drawing room, she overheard Victoria speaking to Geoffrey in a low voice. "You know she was going to cut you out," Victoria said, her tone sharp. "Those debts of yours, she'd had enough." Geoffrey's face flushed. "Don't start, Victoria. You weren't exactly her favorite either." Miss Marple resumed her seat, her knitting needles clicking as if nothing had happened. But her mind was racing, piecing together the fragments. The vial, the letter, the soil smudge. Each was a thread in a tapestry yet to be woven. "It's like that business with the vicar's wife," she thought, recalling a case where a seemingly innocent remark had unraveled a murder. The truth is always there, if one knows where to look. As the evening drew in, the manor's atmosphere grew heavier, the weight of suspicion pressing on every heart. Miss Marple, unnoticed by the others, watched and listened, her quiet presence a reminder that in St. Mary Mead, even the smallest detail could bloom into a revelation. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Village. The morning after Lady Eleanor Hargrove's shocking death in the Rosewood Conservatory, St. Mary Mead awoke to a symphony of whispers. The village, usually content with gossip about misplaced laundry or the vicar's latest sermon, thrummed with speculation about poison and murder. The autumn sun rose over the thatched cottages, painting the cobblestone lanes with a soft golden glow. But the warmth did little to dispel the chill of suspicion that had settled over the community. The church bells rang out their familiar peal, yet even their steady chimes seemed to carry an undercurrent. The door jingled, and Mrs. Cleary looked up from sorting letters, her eyes gleaming with the eagerness of a storyteller. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it dreadful?" Mrs. Cleary began, barely waiting for Miss Marple to set her basket down. "Lady Hargrove, poisoned in her own conservatory. They say it was something in her tea. Can you imagine? And her with no enemies, or so we thought." Miss Marple smiled faintly, adjusting her spectacles. "People often have enemies they don't recognize, Mrs. Cleary. What have you heard?" Mrs. Cleary leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Well, I saw young Geoffrey Hargrove myself just 3 days ago, storming out of the manor after a row with his mother. Red as a beet he was, shouting about money. Something about gambling debts. She was going to cut him off, mark my words. Miss Marple's needles tucked into her basket seemed to itch for action, though she kept her hands still. Debt can make people desperate, she said mildly. But shouting is one thing, and poison quite another. Mrs. Cleary nodded sagely. True, true. But there's more. Mr. Wilkins, the gardener, was in here last week, buying stamps for a letter to London. Grumbling about his wages he was. Said Lady Hargrove hadn't paid him properly in months. And then there's Victoria, that daughter-in-law of hers. Always so high and mighty. But I've seen her posting letters to some fancy address in London. Not her family, mind you. Someone else. Miss Marple filed these tidbits away, her mind turning like the pages of a well-read book. Letters can tell such stories, she remarked. And what of Elsie, the maid? She seemed quite shaken yesterday. Mrs. Cleary's eyes widened. Oh, Elsie. Poor thing. Trembling like a leaf when she came in this morning to post a parcel. Said Lady Hargrove was kind to her, but I've heard otherwise. They say the mistress caught her taking a bit of silver polish, nothing serious. But you know how Lady Hargrove was about her things. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her thoughts sharp. Sir, in the conservatory, I heard Mr. Wilkins bought rat poison at the chemist's last week. Supposedly for the garden, but who can say? Those roses of Lady Hargrove's were her pride and joy. But some plants in that conservatory could kill you as soon as look at you. Miss Marple's lips twitched. Rat poison is such a convenient excuse, she thought. But the truth is rarely so obvious. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where a gardener's purchase had been a red herring, masking a far subtler crime. Another voice, that of Mr. Pippin, the butcher, chimed in. What about that vagrant seen near the manor gates? Shifty fellow lurking about. I wouldn't put it past him to sneak in and tamper with something. Mrs. Harmon nodded eagerly, but Miss Marple shook her head imperceptibly. Strangers seldom meddle in family poisons, she thought. The answer is closer to home, as it always is. As she finished her tea, Miss Marple caught a snippet of conversation from two young women at the counter. Victoria Hargrove's been getting letters from London, one whispered. Not from her solicitor either. Someone with a fancy crest on the envelope. My cousin works at the sorting office, and she swears it's true. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A crest, she mused. Not a lover, perhaps, but someone with influence. A secret worth killing for? She thought of a similar case, where a letter's seal had led to a blackmail scheme. Leaving the tea shop, Miss Marple made her way to the churchyard, where she often found clarity among the weathered gravestones. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fading roses. She paused by a bench, her gaze drifting to Rosewood Manor in the distance, its glass conservatory glinting like a jewel. Her mind turned over the morning's findings. Geoffrey's debts, Mr. Wilkins's grudge, Victoria's letters, Elsie's nervousness. Each was a thread, but the pattern was not yet clear. It's like that business with the vicar's wife, she murmured, settling onto the bench. The clue was in the teacup all along. She recalled how a faint residue in a cup had pointed to a rare plant extract, clicking as she resumed her knitting. Grief takes many forms, Dolly, and so does guilt. What do you make of the household? Dolly frowned. Sir Reginald's putting on a brave face, but he's rattled. Geoffrey's in over his head with those gambling debts. Eleanor was furious about it. Victoria's hiding something, I'm sure of it. And Mr. Wilkins, well, He's always been grumpy, but he's been muttering about the manor's finances. As for Elsie, she's a bundle of nerves, poor girl. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Nerves can be revealing, she said. And so can secrets. Tell me, Dolly, have you noticed anything odd in the conservatory? A plant out of place, perhaps, or a tool misplaced? Dolly thought for a moment. Now that you mention it, there was a pair of pruning shears left on the desk yesterday, not where Eleanor usually kept them. And one of her journals was open to a page about nightshade, of all things. I thought it odd, but she was always scribbling about her plants. Miss Marple's needles paused. Nightshade, she said softly. A curious choice for a gardening journal. She made a mental note to examine the conservatory again, perhaps under the guise of admiring the roses. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the churchyard, Miss Marple rose, her basket swinging gently. The village was alive with whispers, each one a clue in the making. Geoffrey's debts, Victoria's letters, Mr. Wilkins's poison, Elsie's nerves, and now the nightshade in the journal. Each was a piece of the puzzle. The truth, she thought, is like a rose, beautiful, but with thorns that must be navigated carefully. With a final glance at Rosewood Manor, Miss Marple set off for home, her mind weaving the threads of gossip and observation into a tapestry that, she knew, would soon reveal the pattern of a murderer. Chapter 4. The False Alibi. The third day after Lady Eleanor Hargrove's death in the Rosewood Conservatory dawned gray and the case more vexing than he let on. We're dealing with a cunning murderer, he announced to the assembled household, his voice sharp. Someone in this house slipped poison into Lady Hargrove's tea, and I intend to find out who. Let's go over your movements again. Every detail matters. Miss Marple, seated in her usual corner with her knitting, observed the scene with quiet intensity. Her blue eyes, bright behind her spectacles, missed nothing. The way Sir Reginald Hargrove's mustache twitched as he spoke, the nervous flick of Geoffrey's cigarette, the cool detachment in Victoria's posture, the sullen hunch of Mr. Wilkins's shoulders, and the way Elsie's hands twisted her apron into knots. Each gesture, each glance, was a thread in the tapestry of deception she was beginning to unravel. Sir Reginald was the first to be questioned again. He stood ramrod straight, his military bearing as polished as the medals he no longer wore. "I've told you, Inspector," he said, his voice clipped. "I was in the library all morning, reading the Times and catching up on correspondence. I heard nothing until Elsie's scream. Eleanor always took her tea alone in the conservatory. It was her ritual." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a counterpoint to the tension in the room. She noted the library's proximity to the conservatory, separated only by a short corridor. A man in the library, she thought, could easily slip out and back again, unnoticed in the morning's quiet. She recalled a case from years ago where a retired colonel's alibi had crumbled under the weight of a misplaced bookmark. Her eyes drifted to the bookshelf visible through the open door, where a volume on toxicology seemed slightly askew, its spine protruding as if recently handled. Geoffrey Hargrove was next, his casual slouch belying the tension in his jaw. "I was in Much Benham the night before," he said, lighting another cigarette with a shaky hand. "Played cards at the club, stayed late and slept in. Didn't come down until after Mother was found. Ask anyone at the club, they'll vouch for me." Inspector Slack's eyes narrowed. "We did ask Mr. Hargrove. Your friend in London," she said, her gray eyes meeting the inspector's without flinching. I heard Elsie scream and came down at once. I hadn't seen Eleanor since dinner the previous evening. Miss Marple noted the faint scent of Victoria's perfume, jasmine, sharp and distinctive, as she spoke. It was the same scent she'd detected near the conservatory desk, lingering on the air like an accusation. A woman like Victoria, she mused, chooses her words as carefully as her wardrobe. But perfume can linger where words do not. Mr. Wilkins, the gardener, was less composed. His rough hands gripped his cap as if it were a shield. I was in the shed sharpening tools, he growled. Don't know nothing about tea or poison. I keep rat poison for the garden, but it's locked up tight. Lady Hargrove was always fussing over her plants. Maybe she mixed something up herself. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Rat poison, she thought, is a convenient scapegoat, but nightshade is subtler and grows just beyond the conservatory. She recalled Dolly's mention of the gardening journal open to a page on nightshade, a plant that could be harvested with ease by someone who knew its secrets. Elsie the maid was last, her voice barely above a whisper. I brought the tea at 8 like always, she said, her eyes darting to the floor. Lady Hargrove was writing, looked up and smiled. I left the tray and went back to the kitchen. I didn't touch nothing, sir, I swear. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Elsie's apron, where the bulge she'd noticed yesterday was still present. A locket, perhaps, she thought, or something more incriminating. Servants are often the key, though they're overlooked by those who think themselves above them. As Inspector Slack dismissed the suspects to continue his forensic sweep, Miss Marple slipped out to the conservatory, her walking stick tapping a measure beat. The glass dome glowed dully under the overcast sky, and the roses seemed to droop, as if mourning their mistress. She stood by the writing desk, her eyes scanning the scene and brushed against something soft beneath a fern. A glove, stained with a faint chemical smell. It was too small for Mr. Wilkins's rough hands, and its fine leather suggested someone of refinement. Victoria's, perhaps, she wondered, noting its proximity to the desk. But she left it for the police, knowing that a single glove could be a deliberate plant or a careless mistake. Back in the village, a red herring was gaining traction. The butcher, Mr. Pippin, had mentioned a vagrant seen near the manor gates the morning of the murder. A shifty figure with a tattered coat. Inspector Slack, eager for a straightforward solution, dispatched constables to track the man down, convinced he might have tampered with the tea. But Miss Marple, sipping tea at Dolly Bantry's cottage later that day, shook her head. Strangers rarely poison teacups, she said, her voice gentle but firm. This is a family matter, Dolly. The answer lies in the manor, not the hedgerows. Dolly, stirring sugar into her tea, frowned. But who, Jane? Geoffrey's alibi is shaky, and Victoria's too calm for my liking. Sir Reginald's bluster feels forced, and Mr. Wilkins, well, he's always been a grump. And Elsie? She's too timid to poison anyone, surely. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically. Timidity can mask desperation, she said, and alibis like roses can be pruned to look convincing. That glove, for instance, too convenient, perhaps. And the note about betrayal. It suggests someone close to Lady Eleanor, someone she trusted. Dolly's eyes widened. You think it's one of the family? I think, Miss Marple said, her voice soft as the mist outside, that the truth is like a garden. You must dig beneath the surface to find the roots. and roots, my dear, are often tangled. As the afternoon faded into evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind turning over the day's discoveries. The false alibi, the stained glove, the torn note, the misplaced book on toxicology. Each was a clue, but the pattern was incomplete. Observations. Her invitation from Dolly Bantry ensured her presence was welcomed, though Inspector Slack still viewed her with the impatience one reserves for meddlesome aunts. Inside the manor, the drawing room was a study in strained civility. The suspects, Sir Reginald Hargrove, Geoffrey, Victoria, Mr. Wilkins, and Elsie, sat in an uneasy semicircle, their faces etched with varying degrees of fatigue and defensiveness. Inspector Slack, his notebook now dog-eared from constant use, stood before them, his voice sharp with frustration. "We've got a poisoned teacup, a half-written letter, and a vial in the conservatory," he said, ticking off points on his fingers. "Someone in this room knows more than they're saying. I want the truth, and I want it now." Miss Marple, settled in her corner with her knitting, observed the scene with her usual quiet acuity. Her blue eyes, bright behind her spectacles, darted from one suspect to another, noting the way Sir Reginald's fingers tightened around his glass of port, the flicker of Geoffrey's cigarette lighter, the deliberate calm of Victoria's posture, Mr. Wilkins's scowl, and Elsie's nervous fidgeting. Each gesture was a clue, a thread in the intricate tapestry of motive and opportunity she was weaving in her mind. The investigation had deepened, and Miss Marple had spent the previous evening reflecting on the village gossip and the clues unearthed so far. The torn note about betrayal, the chemical-stained glove, the misplaced toxicology book, and the nightshade entry in Lady Eleanor's journal pointed to a crime rooted in intimacy. Someone close to the victim, with access to her habits and her conservatory. Today, she resolved to probe deeper, to unearth the motives that lay buried beneath the surface of Rosewood Manor's polished exterior. Inspector Slack began with Sir Reginald, whose military bluster seemed to falter under scrutiny. "You claim you were in the library," the inspector said, flipping through his notes. "But we found a book on poisons slightly out of place, as if recently handled. Care to explain?" Sir Reginald's mustache twitched, and his nightshade. Geoffrey was next, his boyish charm fraying under the inspector's gaze. "I've told you. I was in Much Benham," he said, his voice edged with defiance. "My alibi's shaky because Thompson's memory is rubbish. I didn't see Mother that morning. She was already dead when I came down." Inspector Slack's eyes narrowed. "Your mother was about to cut you out of her will, wasn't she? Those gambling debts of yours, she'd had enough." Geoffrey's cigarette trembled in his hand. "She was always threatening that," he muttered. "But I didn't need her money. I was sorting things out." Miss Marple noted the sweat on Geoffrey's brow, the way his eyes darted to Victoria. Desperation, she thought, can drive even the charming to dark deeds. And Geoffrey's debts are deeper than he admits. Village gossip, relayed by Mrs. Cleary, confirmed that Geoffrey owed a substantial sum to a bookmaker in London, who had sent threatening letters to the manor. Lady Eleanor's refusal to bail him out had sparked a heated argument, overheard by the postmistress just days before the murder. Victoria Hargrove, questioned next, maintained her icy composure. "I was in my room, as I said," she told the inspector, her voice smooth as polished glass. "Eleanor and I weren't close, but I had no reason to harm her. She was rewriting her will, yes, but I didn't know the details." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Victoria's hands, which were steady but tightly clasped. During a quiet moment later, As the suspects dispersed for tea, Victoria sought out Miss Marple in the conservatory, her composure cracking like thin ice. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low, "I'll be honest with you. I was planning to leave Geoffrey. Eleanor knew and forbade it. She said it would ruin the family's reputation. But I didn't kill her." Miss Marple nodded, her expression gentle but probing. "A woman's secrets," she thought, "are like roses, beautiful but guarded by thorns." Victoria's confession suggested a motive, freedom from a failing marriage. But was it enough for murder? The jasmine perfume lingering near the desk still pointed to demeanor suggested a man more likely to shout than to scheme. Elsie, the maid, was a trembling wreck under Inspector Slack's scrutiny. "I only brought the tea," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "Lady Hargrove was kind mostly, but she caught me taking a bit of silver polish last month. Said she'd sack me if it happened again. I didn't mean no harm." Miss Marple noted the bulge in Elsie's apron, still present. "Fear can mask guilt," she thought, "but it can also mask loyalty." Elsie's knowledge of the manor's routines and her access to the tea tray made her a potential culprit, but her timidity suggested she was more likely a witness than a murderer. Miss Marple resolved to speak with her privately, perhaps over a cup of tea, to coax out any secrets she might hold. As the interrogations concluded, a new distraction emerged. A poisoned cake at the village fete, served the previous day and causing a mild stomach upset among the attendees. Inspector Slack seized on this, suspecting a connection to Lady Eleanor's death. "Could be the same poison," he said, dispatching a constable to investigate. The village buzzed with panic, with Mrs. Pippin at the tea shop declaring it a plague of poison in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, however, was skeptical. "A poisoned cake," she murmured to Dolly over tea, "is too theatrical for this crime. It's a distraction, like the vagrant by the gates. The real poison was in the teacup, and the answer lies here, in the manor." Dolly sighed, stirring her tea. "But who, Jane? Sir Reginald's hiding debts. Geoffrey's drowning in them. Victoria's planning to leave. Mr. Wilkins is furious, and Elsie's terrified. They all have reasons to hate Eleanor. But poison? It's so cold." Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically. "Cold, yes," she said, "but calculated. Poison requires planning, and planning requires motive. We must look beyond the obvious. Debts and grudges are common, but betrayal, as thought, is a house ripe for secrets." The motives were piling up: Sir Reginald's debts, Geoffrey's desperation, Victoria's desire for freedom, Mr. Wilkins's resentment, Elsie's fear. But the truth remained elusive, hidden like a root beneath the soil. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her notebook open. She jotted down the day's findings: the toxicology book, the soil smudge, the nightshade entry, the poisoned cake distraction. "It's like that case with the doctor's wife," she thought, recalling a murder where a seemingly trivial detail, a misplaced spoon, had led to the killer. The answer is here, in the small things waiting to be unearthed. Chapter 6. Twists in the Garden. The 5th day after Lady Eleanor Hargrove's poisoning in the Rosewood Conservatory brought a restless energy to St. Mary Mead. The village, usually content with the gentle ebb and flow of daily routines, was caught in a whirl of speculation, as if the autumn wind itself carried whispers of murder. The mist had cleared, leaving the sky a pale blue, and the roses in the manor's gardens glowed with a defiant vibrancy, their petals untouched by the tragedy within. At Rosewood Manor the investigation had deepened, twisting like the thorny vines that framed the conservatory's glass walls. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped over her shoulders and her basket swinging lightly, arrived at the manor with her usual quiet purpose, invited by Dolly Bantry to keep an eye on things. Her walking stick tapped a steady rhythm on the gravel path, a counterpoint to the unease that permeated the household. Inside the drawing room was a stage of strained civility. The suspects gathered once more under Inspector Slack's impatient scrutiny. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and the faint smoke of Geoffrey's ever-present cigarette. Sir Reginald stood by the window, his military posture rigid, but his eyes weary. Geoffrey slouched in a chair, his charm fraying like a worn coat. Victoria sat poised on the settee, her gray silk dress catching the light, her face a mask of calm. Killer knew its power, and Lady Eleanor's habits. She recalled a case from years ago, where a seemingly innocent herb had masked a murderer's intent. The investigation, she knew, was at a turning point, where false leads and true clues tangled like roots beneath the soil. The morning's interrogations had yielded little new information, but Miss Marple had spent the previous evening sifting through the village gossip and her own observations. The torn note about betrayal, the chemical-stained glove, the misplaced toxicology book, the soil smudge on the desk, and the nightshade entry in Lady Eleanor's journal all pointed to a crime of intimacy. Yet the poisoned cake at the village fete, now dismissed as an unrelated mishap, had stirred panic, and the vagrant by the manor gates remained a distraction. Miss Marple resolved to dig deeper, to follow the threads that led not to red herrings, but to the heart of the crime. She slipped out to the conservatory, her stick tapping gently on the flagstones. The glass dome glowed in the morning light, and the roses seemed to watch her, their fragrance mingling with the earthy scent of damp soil. The desk where Lady Eleanor had died was now bare, stripped of its teacup and teapot by the police, but Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the surrounding plants. The orchids, exotic and delicate, arched toward the sun, but it was the nightshade in the garden border, just beyond the glass, that held her attention. Its dark berries gleamed, deceptively inviting, and she recalled Dolly's mention of the gardening journal open to a page on its properties. As she examined the desk, she noticed a new detail. The inkwell was askew, its lid slightly ajar, as if someone had rummaged through it in haste. "Looking for the will, perhaps?" she murmured, thinking of Victoria's mention of Lady Eleanor rewriting her estate plans. The torn note about betrayal, now in Inspector Slack's possession, suggested a confrontation. But with whom? Miss Marple's mind turned to a similar case, where a misplaced pen had revealed a thief's panic. People always overlook the obvious, she thought, and the obvious is often the key. Her reverie was interrupted by a trap, she thought, recalling a case where a planted handkerchief had led the police astray. She resolved to keep an eye on the gloves, for their owner might reveal more than they intended. The investigation took a new turn when news arrived of Geoffrey's sudden trip to London the previous evening. Inspector Slack, informed by a constable, confronted him in the drawing room. "You claimed you were here all night," the inspector said, his voice accusing. "But a villager saw your car on the London road at midnight. Care to explain?" Geoffrey's face paled, his cigarette dropping ash onto the carpet. I needed to see a friend," he stammered. About alone. It's nothing to do with Mother's death. Miss Marple's needles paused. Alone, she thought, or an escape. She recalled Mrs. Cleary's gossip about Geoffrey's debts to a London bookmaker, whose threats had grown more menacing. Had Geoffrey gone to plead for time, or to cover his tracks? His shaky alibi, already crumbling, now seemed more like a house of cards. Victoria, questioned next, revealed a surprising detail. "I've been corresponding with a solicitor in London," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes flicking toward Geoffrey. "Not a lover, as some might think, but about a divorce. Eleanor knew and disapproved, but I had no reason to harm her." Miss Marple noted the tension in Victoria's shoulders, the way her fingers tightened around her sherry glass. Divorce, she thought, is a powerful motive, especially when inheritance is at stake. The jasmine perfume still lingering in her memory from the conservatory kept Victoria in the frame, though whether as culprit or scapegoat was unclear. Mr. Wilkins, pressed about the nightshade, admitted to pruning the garden border, but denied touching the berries. "I know they're poison," he said, his scowl deepening. "I told Lady Hargrove to rip them out, but she said they added character to the garden." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Character, she thought, or opportunity. Mr. Wilkins's knowledge of plants made him a suspect, but his blunt honesty suggested he lacked the guile for such a subtle crime. "Vagrant is a distraction," she said, her voice soft but firm. "The poison came from within the manor, not from a stranger's hand." Dolly, stirring her tea, frowned. "But who, Jane? Geoffrey's lying about London, Victoria's plotting a divorce, so Reginald's hiding debts. Mr. Wilkins is furious and Elsie's a nervous wreck. They all had reasons to hate Eleanor." Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically. "Hate is common," she said, "but poison requires patience. The inkwell, the gloves, the nightshade, they point to someone who planned carefully, someone who knew Eleanor's routines." As evening fell, Miss Marple returned to the conservatory, drawn by a nagging sense that she'd missed something. The roses glowed in the fading light, their scent almost overpowering. She paused by the desk, her eyes catching a faint scratch on the wood, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. "The will," she murmured, "or something else hidden." She thought of a case where a hidden drawer had revealed a killer's secret, and resolved to examine the desk more closely when the police were not watching. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her notebook open. She jotted down the day's findings: the askew inkwell, the second glove, Geoffrey's London trip, Victoria's divorce, the nightshade's accessibility. "It's like that business with the rector's sister," she thought, recalling a murder where a misplaced letter had led to the truth. The answer is in the conservatory, waiting to bloom. Chapter 7. The Overlooked Detail. The 6th day since Lady Eleanor Hargrove's poisoning in the Rosewood Conservatory brought a fragile clarity to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself sensed the investigation nearing a turning point. The autumn sun filtered through thinning clouds, casting dappled light across the manor's gardens, where roses clung stubbornly to their blooms despite the chill. The air carried a crisp edge, laced with the faint sweetness of decaying leaves and the earthy promise of winter. At Rosewood Manor, the atmosphere was taut, the household caught in a web of suspicion that grew tighter with each passing hour. Miss J. of composure that betrayed nothing. Mr. Wilkins, the gardener, hovered near the door, his cap crumpled in his hands, while Elsie, the maid, busied herself with the tea tray, her movements jerky with anxiety. Miss Marple, settling into her corner with her knitting, watched them all, her blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles, catching every nuance as if they were stitches in a pattern only she could discern. Inspector Slack, his patience worn thin, paced before the gathered suspects, his notebook a tattered record of the case's complexities. "The laboratory confirms nightshade in the tea," he said, his voice sharp with frustration. "It was no accident. Someone in this room knew Lady Hargrove's habits and used them against her. I want the truth, and I'm running out of patience." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a rhythm that anchored her thoughts. Nightshade, she mused. So accessible, yet so deliberate. The killer was close to Lady Eleanor, close enough to know her morning ritual. The clues, the torn note about the trail, the chemical-stained gloves, the misplaced toxicology book, the soil smudge on the desk, the askew inkwell, were beginning to form a pattern, but a crucial piece was missing. Today, she resolved to find it, to uncover the overlooked detail that would unravel the mystery. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during afternoon tea at Dolly Bantry's cottage, where Miss Marple had retreated to escape the manor's tension. Dolly, pouring tea with her usual vigor, recounted a conversation with Elsie from earlier that day. "The poor girl was near tears," Dolly said, passing Miss Marple a cup. "She kept clutching a locket in her apron pocket, said it was a gift from Lady Hargrove, years ago, for her loyalty. But she admitted Eleanor could be harsh, always checking the silver and accusing her of pilfering." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A locket, she thought, recalling the bulge in Elsie's apron. Loyalty can mask resentment, and resentment can simmer into something darker. She sipped her tea, her mind turning to a case for Elsie, flustered but compliant, led her to the small, tidy space where the tea tray was prepared each morning. The sink gleamed, and a rack held an array of cups. But the forget-me-not teacup was missing, bagged as evidence. Miss Marple's eyes fell on a small jar of cleaning powder on the counter. Its label faded, but its contents faintly scented with a chemical tang. Curious, she thought, to keep such a powder near the tea things. Borrowing a magnifying glass from the vicar later that day, Miss Marple returned to the conservatory, her steps deliberate. The glass dome glowed in the afternoon light, and the roses seemed to whisper secrets as she approached the desk. The police had removed most evidence, but she examined the teapot's base, still on the desk for cataloging. Under the magnifying glass, she detected a faint residue, not on the spout but on the handle, where a thumb might rest. "Nightshade," she murmured, applied with precision, perhaps with a cloth or glove. The residue was subtle, easily missed by a hurried inspector. But to Miss Marple, it was a beacon. Her thoughts returned to the locket in Elsie's apron. Could the maid, driven by years of slights, have tampered with the cup? Yet Elsie's timidity suggested fear rather than cunning. Miss Marple considered the other suspects: Sir Reginald's debts, Geoffrey's desperation, Victoria's divorce plans, Mr. Wilkins's grudge. Each had motive, but the teacup's intimacy pointed to someone who knew Lady Eleanor's habits best. In the drawing room, Inspector Slack's interrogations continued, focusing on Sir Reginald's alibi. A housemaid, questioned separately, admitted seeing him near the conservatory door that morning, arguing with Lady Eleanor about family matters. He was red in the face, the maid said, and she told him to leave her be. Sir Reginald, confronted with this, blustered. "A minor disagreement," he said, his voice strained. "Eleanor was upset about my selling a few old trinkets. Nothing serious. Miss Marple's needles clicked. There, she said. My perfume lingers, it proves nothing. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Perfume, she thought, is a signature, but signatures can be forged. Victoria's composure was a shield, but her divorce plans and the note about betrayal kept her in the frame. Mr. Wilkins, grilled about the nightshade, insisted he'd warned Lady Eleanor to remove it. I cut it back, but she wouldn't let me uproot it, he said. Said it was part of the garden's charm. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Charm, she thought, or a convenient weapon. Mr. Wilkins' access to the plants was undeniable, but his bluntness suggested he lacked the subtlety for poison. Elsie, tearful under questioning, clutched her apron pocket. I loved Lady Hargrove, she said. She gave me this locket when I started here. I'd never hurt her. Miss Marple, watching closely, saw the locket's outline. A heart-shaped trinket, not a vial. Loyalty, she thought, but with a shadow of resentment. She resolved to speak with Elsie alone, to probe the maid's memories of the tea tray's preparation. As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple sat with Dolly over tea, the fire crackling in the cottage hearth. The teacup is the key, she said, her voice soft. Someone knew its significance to Eleanor, and someone ensured the poison reached her lips. Dolly frowned. But who? Jane? Sir Reginald was arguing with her, Geoffrey's lying, Victoria's scheming. Mr. Wilkins knows plants and Elsie's terrified. They all fit. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically. They do, she said. But the truth is in the details. The residue on the teapot, the locket, the nightshade. It's like that case with the doctor's sister, where a single cup held the answer. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple opened her notebook, jotting down the day's findings. The teapot residue, Elsie's locket, Sir Reginald's argument, the nightshade's accessibility. The pattern is emerging, she thought, like a rose unfolding its petals. One more clue, and the truth will bloom. Jane's keen eye was closing in on the truth. The drawing room was a crucible of nerves. The suspects gathered under Inspector Slack's relentless scrutiny. Sir Reginald Hargrove stood by the fireplace, his military bearing frayed, his glass of port trembling in his hand. Geoffrey slouched in a chair, his cigarette smoke curling upward, his boyish charm replaced by a haggard edge. Victoria sat on the velvet settee, her gray silk dress immaculate, but her eyes guarded. Mr. Wilkins, the gardener, lingered near the door, his cap twisted into a knot, while Elsie, the maid, fussed with the tea tray, her hands shaking so badly that a spoon clattered to the floor. Miss Marple, settled in her corner with her knitting, watched them all, her blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles, catching every flinch, every glance, as if they were threads in a tapestry nearing completion. Inspector Slack, his notebook now a battered relic of the case, paced with barely contained frustration. The nightshade was in the teacup, he said, his voice cutting through the room's silence. Someone in this house knew Lady Hargrove's habits and used them to kill her. We've got a vial, a note about betrayal, and a glove. Someone's lying, and I'm done with games. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm that grounded her thoughts. The teacup, she mused. So intimate, so deliberate. The killer was someone who knew Eleanor's rituals, someone close enough to touch her life daily. The clues, the torn note, the chemical-stained gloves, the misplaced toxicology book, the soil smudge, the askew inkwell, the teapot residue, Elsie's locket. were converging, but the final piece was still elusive. Today, she sensed, would bring it into focus. The interrogations resumed with Sir Reginald, whose alibi was crumbling like dry leaves. The housemaid's testimony about his argument with Lady Eleanor near the conservatory had shaken him. And now a new detail emerged. A footman had seen him pacing the corridor just before Elsie's scream. London trip, supposedly to secure a loan, had yielded no money, and his alibi remained shaky. "I didn't see Mother that morning," he insisted, his cigarette trembling. "I was in my room, sleeping off the night." "You've got no proof I was near the conservatory." Inspector Slack leaned forward. "No proof? Your debts are piling up, Mr. Hargrove. Your mother was about to cut you out of her will. That's motive enough for me." Miss Marple noted the sweat on Geoffrey's brow, the way his eyes darted to Victoria. Desperation, she thought, can drive a man to act rashly. But poison requires planning. Geoffrey's access to the nightshade in the garden border was undeniable, but his impulsiveness suggested a less calculated crime. Still, his lies about London kept him in the frame. Victoria, pressed about her perfume in the conservatory, maintained her icy calm. "I visited Eleanor often," she said, her voice smooth. "My scent lingers. It's no surprise. As for the will, I knew she was rewriting it, but I didn't know the details." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A half-truth, she thought, recalling Victoria's confession about her divorce plans. The note about betrayal could point to her, especially if Lady Eleanor had threatened to block her freedom. The jasmine perfume was a persistent clue, but whether it implicated Victoria or was a deliberate misdirection remained unclear. She thought of a case where a woman's perfume had been used to frame her, a classic twist in the game of deception. Mr. Wilkins, questioned about the nightshade, grew defensive. "I told you I cut it back, but Lady Hargrove wouldn't let me uproot it," he said, his scowl deepening. "I bought rat poison for the shed, locked up tight. You won't find my fingerprints on no teacup." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Knowledge of plants, she thought, is a double-edged sword. Mr. Wilkins could have harvested nightshade, but his bluntness suggests he's no poisoner. Still, his unpaid wages and resentment kept conservatory, drawn by the nagging sense that the space held more secrets. The glass dome glowed softly, and the roses seemed to watch her, their petals curling inward as if guarding their knowledge. She examined the desk again, her magnifying glass borrowed from the vicar revealing a new detail. A faint scratch on the inkwell's base, as if it had been pried open. "Searching for something," she murmured. "Perhaps the will, or something more personal." The note about betrayal suggested a confrontation, and the inkwell's disturbance hinted at a hurried act. Her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion in the hall. Victoria and Geoffrey were arguing, their voices low but heated. "You knew she was changing the will," Geoffrey hissed. "You wanted her gone as much as I did." Victoria's voice was sharp. "Don't pin this on me, Geoffrey. Your debts are your own mess." Miss Marple paused, her knitting tucked under her arm. A fractured marriage, she thought, breeds suspicion. But are they accomplices or enemies? The argument suggested a shared secret, but the note's mention of betrayal pointed to one betraying the other. or both betraying Lady Eleanor. Back at Dolly's cottage for tea, Miss Marple shared her findings. "The teacup's residue is key," she said, her voice soft. "The poison was applied to the handle, not the tea itself, suggesting someone handled it after Elsie left the tray. And the locket. Elsie's loyalty may be genuine, but her fear suggests she knows more." Dolly frowned, stirring her tea. "But who, Jane? Sir Reginald's alibi is falling apart. Geoffrey's lying. Victoria's too calm. Mr. Wilkins knows plants, and Elsie's terrified. They all fit." Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically. "They do," she said, "but the truth is narrowing. The scratch on the inkwell, the residue on the teapot, the argument. They point to someone close, someone who acted with precision." As evening fell, Walls sensed the investigation's climax. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl neatly draped and her walking stick tapping a resolute rhythm, arrived at the manor at Dolly Bantry's insistence, her quiet presence a beacon in the storm of suspicion. Today, she knew, the truth would bloom, as inevitable as the roses in the conservatory. The drawing room was a crucible of tension. The suspects gathered at Miss Marple's request, a rare intervention that even Inspector Slack, with his bristling impatience, could not ignore. Sir Reginald Hargrove stood by the fireplace, his military posture crumbling, his glass of port untouched. Geoffrey slouched in a chair, his cigarette unlit, his boyish charm replaced by a hollow-eyed weariness. Victoria sat on the velvet settee, her gray silk dress a stark contrast to her guarded expression. Mr. Wilkins, the gardener, hovered near the door, his cap a twisted knot in his hands, while Elsie, the maid, stood by the tea tray, her apron trembling with her nerves. Miss Marple, in her corner with her knitting, observed them all, her blue eyes sharp behind her spectacles, weaving the threads of clues into a tapestry now ready to be unveiled. Inspector Slack, his notebook clutched like a talisman, stood before the group, his scowl softened by a grudging respect for Miss Marple's persistence. "Miss Marple has something to say," he announced, his voice clipped. "I'll hear her out, but I expect answers, not theories." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "Thank you, Inspector," she said, her voice soft but commanding attention, like a gentle breeze that silences a storm. "The murderer is among us, and the truth has been hiding in plain sight, like a rose among thorns. Lady Eleanor Hargrove was poisoned with nightshade in her tea, administered by someone who knew her habits intimately. Someone in this room." The suspects shifted uneasily, their eyes darting to one another. Sir Reginald cleared his throat. Geoffrey lit his cigarette with a trembling hand. Victoria's fingers tightened on her sherry glass. Mr. Wilkins's scowl deepened. Marple's eyes swept the group, settling briefly on each suspect. "The real clues," she said, "were in the conservatory, in the small things we overlook. The torn note about betrayal, the soil smudge on the desk, the misplaced toxicology book, the askew inkwell, the residue on the teapot handle, and the locket in Elsie's apron. Each pointed to a truth, but the key was the teacup, Lady Eleanor's cherished forget-me-not cup, used only by her." She turned to Elsie, whose eyes widened. "Elsie, you told me Lady Hargrove scolded you harshly the day before her death, accusing you of carelessness with the tea tray. You loved her, didn't you? The locket you carry, a gift from her, proves your loyalty. But loyalty can coexist with resentment. Did you see something that morning? Elsie's tears spilled over. I didn't do it, Miss Marple. I brought the tea like always. She was writing, looked up and smiled. I left the tray and went back to the kitchen. I swear. Miss Marple nodded gently. I believe you, Elsie. But you saw someone near the conservatory, didn't you? Someone who shouldn't have been there. Elsie hesitated, then nodded, her voice a whisper. It was Mr. Jeffrey. He came in just as I was leaving, said he needed to speak to his mother. I thought nothing of it. He was her son. The room gasped, and Jeffrey's cigarette fell to the carpet. That's nonsense, he shouted, his face pale. I was in my room sleeping. Miss Marple's gaze turned to Jeffrey, steady and unyielding. You were seen, Jeffrey, not only by Elsie, but by a footman who saw you slip into the conservatory. Your alibi about Much Benham was a lie, and your London trip was a desperate attempt to beg a loan to cover your gambling debts. Your mother was about to cut you out of her will, wasn't she? You knew she was rewriting it, and you couldn't bear to lose everything. Jeffrey's eyes darted to Victoria, then back to Miss Marple. You've got no proof, he stammered. I didn't touch her tea. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. The proof is in the teapot handle, Jeffrey. To protect your future, didn't you? Victoria's composure cracked, her sherry glass trembling. I only wanted to see the will, she admitted, her voice low. I went in after Jeffrey left, but she was already dead. I swear I didn't touch the tea. Miss Marple nodded. I believe you, Victoria. But your presence confused the trail, and Jeffrey used it to his advantage, knowing your perfume would cast suspicion on you. Jeffrey, cornered, collapsed into his chair, his face buried in his hands. I didn't mean to kill her, he sobbed. I just wanted her to listen, to give me one more chance. I put the nightshade in the teapot handle thinking it would make her ill, scare her into helping me. I didn't know it would. I didn't know. The room exhaled in shock, Sir Reginald's glass clattering to the floor, Victoria's eyes wide with horror, Mr. Wilkins muttering under his breath, and Elsie weeping openly. Inspector Slack, his face a mix of triumph and disbelief, signaled for Jeffrey to be taken into custody. You've done it, Miss Marple, he said gruffly. I'd have chased that vagrant for weeks. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her eyes held a flicker of sadness. It's always the small things, she said softly. The teapot handle, the fingerprint, the locket. They tell the story when we listen. Jeffrey's desperation blinded him, as it did in a case I once knew, where a son's greed led to tragedy. As the constables led Jeffrey away, the drawing room felt emptier, the weight of truth replacing the weight of suspicion. Sir Reginald sank into a chair, his face ashen. Victoria stared out the window, her composure a fragile shell. Mr. Wilkins muttered about the garden, and Elsie, still clutching her locket, slipped away to the kitchen. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, her work here nearly done. It's like that business with the Admiral's nephew, she thought, recalling a case where a single clue, a smudged glass, had revealed a killer. The truth is always there, waiting to be seen. Their familiar peal, a comforting rhythm that signaled a return to normalcy, though the shadow of Lady Eleanor Hargrove's poisoning lingered like a faint mist. At Miss Jane Marple's modest cottage on High Street, the air was filled with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed Earl Grey and warm scones. A setting as cozy as the mystery's resolution was satisfying. Miss Marple had invited Dolly Bantry and Inspector Slack for morning tea, a ritual she cherished for its ability to foster clarity and conversation. Her sitting room was a haven of quiet charm. Chintz curtains framed the windows, a fire crackled in the hearth, and her knitting lay neatly folded on a side table, its needles silent for now. The tea tray, set with a porcelain pot and delicate cups, stood ready, and a plate of scones, baked by her housekeeper, Mrs. Hart, added a touch of homely warmth. Miss Marple, her gray hair pinned neatly and her shawl draped over her shoulders, sat in her favorite armchair, her blue eyes bright with the satisfaction of a puzzle solved. Dolly Bantry arrived first, her bright scarf a splash of color against the muted tones of the room. "Jane, you're a marvel," she said, sinking into a chair with a sigh. "I still can't believe it was Geoffrey. Poor Eleanor, done in by her own son. How did you put it all together?" Inspector Slack followed, his usual brusqueness softened by a grudging respect. He adjusted his tie, a rare concession to civility, and accepted a cup of tea with a nod. "I'll admit, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff, "you saw what I missed. That teapot handle. Never would have thought to check it for residue. But I'd like to hear the whole story, start to finish." Miss Marple smiled faintly, pouring tea with a steady hand. "It's always the small things, Inspector," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "Like a rose in a garden. The truth is there if you know where to look. Let me explain, over tea, how it all came together." She began with the discovery of Lady Eleanor's body in the Rosewood. Early distractions. The vagrant by the manor gates. The poisoned cake at the fete. The chemical-stained gloves. "Red herrings," she said, "meant to mislead. The vagrant was a passerby. The cake a coincidence, and the gloves, too small for Mr. Wilkins, too worn for Victoria or Sir Reginald, were likely planted to confuse us." Inspector Slack nodded, his teacup clinking against its saucer. "I fell for that vagrant nonsense," he admitted. "Wasted a day chasing him." Miss Marple's smile was kind. "It's easy to be swayed by the obvious, Inspector. But the real clues were in the conservatory. The torn note about betrayal. The soil smudge on the desk. The misplaced toxicology book. The askew inkwell. The residue on the teapot handle. And Elsie's locket. Each was a petal in the rose of truth." She turned to the note, found tucked beneath an orchid pot. "Your betrayal will not stand," she quoted. It suggested a confrontation. Someone Lady Eleanor trusted, but who had wounded her. At first I thought of Victoria, whose divorce plans Eleanor opposed, or Sir Reginald, whose embezzlement she'd uncovered. But the note's tone was personal, almost familial. Dolly leaned forward. "So it pointed to Geoffrey?" Miss Marple nodded. Geoffrey's debts were a constant source of tension. Mrs. Cleary at the post office mentioned a heated argument days before the murder, and Eleanor's threat to cut him out of her will was confirmed by Victoria. But it was the teacup that sealed it. She explained the forget-me-not cup, Lady Eleanor's cherished ritual. Elsie told me it was washed by hand, never left in the kitchen. The poison wasn't in the teapot but on the handle, where a thumb might rest when pouring. The laboratory found nightshade residue there, applied with precision, likely with a cloth dipped in a solution made from the garden's berries. Inspector Slack's eyes widened. Elsie's nerves. Miss Marple's voice softened. Sir Reginald's embezzlement made him a suspect, but his argument with Eleanor was about shame, not murder. Mr. Wilkins's knowledge of nightshade was tempting, but his bluntness lacked the guile for poison. Elsie's locket was a symbol of loyalty, not guilt. Her fear came from witnessing Geoffrey's presence, though she didn't understand its significance until pressed. Dolly sighed, nibbling a scone. It's so tragic. Geoffrey, driven by greed, killing his own mother. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes tinged with sadness. It's like that case with the vicar's nephew years ago, she said. A young man, desperate for money, let his weaknesses blind him. Geoffrey thought a small dose would only sicken Eleanor, forcing her to reconsider his inheritance. But Nightshade is unforgiving, and his miscalculation was fatal. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. You've got a knack, Miss Marple. I'd have been chasing that vagrant for weeks without you. Miss Marple smiled faintly. The truth is always there, Inspector, in the small things. Teacup handles, smudged fingerprints, a locket's weight. People are like gardens. Their secrets bloom if you know where to look. As the tea grew cold, the conversation turned to the village's recovery. St. Mary Mead was returning to its gentle rhythm, the manor's tragedy a dark chapter now closed. Sir Reginald, humbled by his debts, had promised to make amends. Victoria, free to pursue her divorce, was planning to leave for London. Mr. Wilkins, grumbling but relieved, returned to his roses, while Elsie, her locket a quiet comfort, resumed her duties with a lighter heart. Miss Marple poured another round of tea, her movements precise. The manor will heal, she said, as villages do. The roses will bloom again, and St. Mary Mead will go on as it always has. Dolly raised her cup. To your sharp eyes, Jane. You've saved us from a shadow. Inspector Slack, with a rare chuckle, joined